Look, this story begins with Ethan Morales kneeling in the mud at dawn, hands sunk into wet earth, while a thin rain rattled the tin roof over his kitchen. He had tended this small ranch since boyhood, waking before light to check the corral, to pull damp hay into mangers, to listen to the breath of the land. His face was weathered, his fingers cracked, and he moved with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to talk to the soil. One afternoon, his father, Julian, arrived on a cart that creaked like an old door, the smell of diesel and tobacco sticking to his coat. Julian sat on the step and, after a long pause filled with the creak of leather and the distant lowing of cattle, he said plainly, "Ethan, these acres will be yours. But there is one condition. Never sell or give away the bull. Do not let it go." Ethan laughed at first, a sound of disbelief that mingled with the rain. But there was a tremor in Julian's voice that sank like cold clay. The warning lodged in Ethan like a stone. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet hay and a far bell that marked the hour. The light through the kitchen window was thin and yellow like old photographs, and for a moment Ethan felt the weight of an unspoken cost pressing into his chest. What he did not know then was how that single sentence would begin to reshape every season that followed. If you think you would act different, leave a note at the end. Tell us if you would keep or break a promise like that, and why. Months later, illness took Julian. The house smelled of boiled herbs and the sharp acid of disinfectant. Rosa, Ethan's sister, folded towels with hands that shook and whispered old hymns. Tomas, the shopkeeper, came by with a loaf and blunt condolences, and Marta from the next valley stood in the yard with eyes full of questions. The wake was a low room of soft voices, of shoes on clay floors, of a photograph of Julian with a hat in his hands. When the coffin closed, Ethan felt a rawness in his throat, an ache like a plow cut in the back. He signed papers that smelled like printer ink, and then he walked the fields alone, the wind tasting of iron and the distant rot of a damp fence post. The ranch was his now, the corral his responsibility, and the old warning repeated itself in his head like a chorus, clear and impossible to ignore. He promised the gathered few that he would honor his father, that he would not sell or give away the bull. Louis, a neighbor, clapped his shoulder and said, "Good man." Padre Alberto stood apart, face grave, and said nothing. That night, the moon was a thin coin, and the earth thrummed under Ethan's boots, as if the land itself waited. At first, the ranch behaved like any other after a change of hands. The cows grazed, the pond reflected the sky, and the seeds took. But then small things shifted. On a clear morning, the ducks in the pond were found huddled, feathers slick, eyes narrow as if they had seen a shadow. The chickens began to line up and stare at a patch of fence until their combs trembled. A breeze carried a metallic note like far-off bells. And once Ethan saw a hoof print that was too deep and too crisp, as if something heavy had stepped and then been suddenly withdrawn. The nights began to hold a new thickness, a humidity that made the hair on his arms stand up. Smells altered too, hay smelling of smoke in one moment and of rot in the next. He heard a distant trampling at odd hours, a cadence like hooves walking on a roof of leaves. In the pantry, a jar rattled, though no one touched it. He spoke with Rosa by the stove. "You think it is the bull?" she asked, her voice low and rough with worry. "I do not know," Ethan replied, running a hand over his mouth as if to steady himself. "But something watches when the moon is gone." Marta came by and told of a neighbor's dog that refused to cross the lane. It bayed at nothing, she said, pressing her palms to the window as if she could hold the light. Senses sharpened, and the ranch grew smaller and stranger by the day. One evening, drawn by a smell like wet iron, Ethan opened the old barn with a lantern. The wood creaked, and the light cut a thin cone through dust motes. The air smelled of hay and old sweat and something acrid underneath, like burned sugar. There, in the gloom, stood the bull. Its coat was coal black, and the lantern trembled in Ethan's hands. It did not move, but its eyes were two coals burning a slow, steady red, like embers under ash. The sound of Ethan's own breath seemed absurdly loud. He felt his knees go soft. "Good God," he breathed. The bull exhaled, and a hot, sulphurous breath ghosted the hairs on Ethan's neck. He remembered Julian's voice. He stepped closer, and the floor seemed to tilt. "Who brought you here?" he whispered. The bull answered with a low snort that felt like a drum in the ribs. Ethan reached out. His hand hovered above the beast, and the air sparked with something that smelled of rain on iron and old coins. He felt a familiarity there, too, a recognition like meeting an old friend who had become someone else. He stumbled back, his lantern clattering, light fracturing across the animal's eyes, which flared redder and then softer, as if listening. Prosperity arrived in a way that made the village whisper. Where fields had been stunted under drought, Ethan's corn grew tall and glossy. The harvest was rich, the hay heavy and sweet, and buyers from the market paid well for his beef. Neighbors who had watched their own fields fail crossed the lane to marvel, to ask what had changed. "You have done something right," said Tomas with a grin while his fingers drummed the counter. Yet with the stacks of feed and the coins came a narrowing around Ethan's chest. At night he woke to the smell of burning grass, even when there was none. He saw at the edge of the lot a shadow that was thicker than shade, heard a hoofbeat that did not belong to any animal he knew. In town, people spoke of his good fortune with a cocktail of envy and fear. Marta stood in his doorway once, the light behind her like a memory. "It feeds you," she said quietly, "but what feeds back?" The question settled like dust. There were times Ethan walked the rows of corn and imagined eyes in every stalk, red pinpricks glowing from within the green. He counted gains against unease, fingers closing on each coin as if to weigh the cost. When he could no longer bear the quiet gnawing in his gut, Ethan went to Don Bosco, an old man who had a reputation for knowing things the rest pretended not to notice. Don Bosco lived by the river, a porch of rotting planks and jars of dried herbs that smelled of camphor. They sat with cups of lukewarm coffee and watched the water move. Ethan leaned forward. "There is something here that is not mine," he said. Don Bosco inhaled slowly, his eyes milky with age. "You were told not to let the bull go," he said. "A bargain was made long before you were born." Ethan asked, "Did my father make it?" "Your father kept it," said Don Bosco, "but the keeping is only one way to feed a bargain. A pact takes and gives in equal terror." Ethan's voice went tight. "How do I end it?" Don Bosco tapped the table. "You cannot simply lift a hand and unmake what was woven. There are words, rights, and costs. There are three who remember the night the bull arrived. Find Marta, the midwife. Find Louis, who watched the cart. Find Padre Alberto, who blessed the ground. Together you might pull at the thread." Marta came to the porch that evening. Rosa followed. Padre Alberto arrived with a small Bible and an old rosary, and Tomas stood on the fringe with a lamp. The conversation grew into an exchange of memory, each voice punctuated by a cough or the creak of a chair. "It came with a wagon," Louis said. "No driver, no horse, just a crate and a smell." "There were a few coins," Padre Alberto added, "gold with strange marks." They argued softly about what to do, each line of dialogue a small hammer on metal, each silence a reflection of sky. The plan was frail but real. They would. The night they chose to act, the air was cold enough to burn the breath. Ethan, Marta, Rosa, Padre Alberto, and Don Bosco walked to the barn with ropes and iron and a book of prayers that smelled of dust and candle wax. The corral gate rasped. The bull stood at the center like a statue of living night, eyes like simmering coals that watched them come. Ethan stepped forward with a rope, and his voice shook. "We are taking you away," he said. The bull's breath smelled of coal and old wounds. Padre Alberto intoned prayers under his breath, and Don Bosco hummed a rhythm that sounded like an old lullaby turned inside out. The animal moved almost imperceptibly, a shift of muscle, and then a sound like many feet running erupted from the beyond. It was the hush of 1,000 leaves, the grinding of soil, and then voices that were not quite human, calling names. From the shadow by the fence came figures that had the shape of men, but the hollow look of ghosts. Ethan saw his father's face among them, a pale outline with eyes that glittered like wet stone. "Ethan," the specter said, voice like wind through a pipe, "you promised." Ethan felt his knees give. Marta gripped his arm and said, "Do not look at them as if you owe them anything." The chase that followed was not like any chase of flesh. The earth seemed to tilt, the barn doors shuddered, and the wind took on a direction that pushed them like a hand. They ran through the yard with hay cracking underfoot, with the taste of metal in their mouths, with the stench of sulfur and old rain. Padre Alberto fell and rose and called louder, uttering prayers that seemed at times to thin the air. Don Bosco threw the book into the fire, and the flames spat blue and white, then black, as if they rejected the pages. At one point Ethan faced the bull and said in a voice he barely recognized, "I will not be traded for comfort." The bull lowered its head, and the red in its eyes pulsed once, like a warning or a pulse of sorrow. Then it stepped back, melting into shadow that crawled along the barn floor like spilled ink. They found the corral empty at dawn, hoofprints leading to the river and then stopping, as if the earth had closed over them. The neighbors watched from porches, faces pale, mouths open like small caves. In the weeks that followed, the harvest still brought grain, though the golden weight had a brittle sound. The ranch returned to a quieter rhythm, but absence can press as solidly as presence. Ethan felt as if a cord had been cut inside him. He mended fences and fixed a leaking trough, each physical act a small appeal to normal life. People said the phenomena had left, others whispered that it only slept. Rosa planted a cloud of fog fern.